In this roundup of the week, chaos over fantasy exam results highlights the damage done to young people by coronavirus lockdown. Joe Biden names his running mate, signalling the real start of the presidential campaign. And Ben & Jerry's diversifies from making ice cream into schooling the UK government on handling illegal immigration. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show for changemakers. Welcome back to the unexpected exam question that is 2020. I hope you're well and dodging the virus. And this week we have seen some new developments on the coronavirus front. Spain continues to suffer a significant second wave, and others such as France and to a lesser degree Germany, not back to the thick of the pandemic, but significantly higher and trending upwards. Brazil and India, along with Peru, are still in the worst state. We've seen a small cluster of cases in New Zealand soon after the country celebrated 100 days without any cases in the community at all, where, unlike the rest of the world, people have been able to lead a normal life, with the exception of the shutdown of the tourist industry. But now a small cluster of cases has got the country locking down again, actively tracking and tracing those cases to try to hold on to that precious virus-free reality. And I must say, some of the people who are anti-lockdown and pro-Sweden and all of that side have been actively revelling in the fact that 1 minute New Zealand was celebrating 100 days and the next they're facing a new set of cases. When you get so heavily into your ideological position in favour of something that you start willing other people to fail and celebrating when people catch this potentially fatal virus, you need to take a careful look at yourself. Let's wish for every country to be successful. Let's get rid of this thing, get it completely out of the way, then we can debate who did it the best. But celebrating when others have a setback doesn't really make you a great human being. It's not as though these sorts of decisions were made according to the science. You probably think they were, because that's what we're continually told. We have followed the science at every step. But a paper published this week shows that actually the majority of democratic states simply followed each other. Carl Wenberg, one of the report's authors, said this: "We found that the decisions were not based on, or had a very weak correlation to, standard epidemiological indicators such as number of cases, number of deaths, ICU capacity, etc. More important has been how many neighbouring countries have already implemented measures." And that certainly matches what we know about the UK experience, because we already have testimony to the effect that the SAGE committee that was advising the government assumed that the UK population would not put up with China-style lockdown policies. It was only when they saw Italy implementing such policies they realised that, well, actually this was an option that they could follow as well. And it seems they weren't the only ones. It's arguably a dangerous situation because it presents the obvious danger of government-level groupthink. One country does a thing. Very quickly it becomes the obvious and intuitive thing to do, which is really how we got to lockdown in the first place. The bigger question about whether you do more damage in your reaction than you would have suffered from the disease on its own, then that doesn't get asked, because every politician knows that to stand out from the herd when they're all doing the same thing is going to be to invite possible devastating judgment as the deaths pile up. And every country has critics queuing up to take potshots at their own leadership, including the countries that we think have done pretty well. Only Sweden was prepared to go its own way, and plenty have been attacking it ever since. Meanwhile, in the UK, we've not only reduced our cases in the present day, but by a sheer miracle, we've reduced them historically as well. This comes about because of a piece of work done 3 weeks ago by Carl Hennigan and Yoon Loke, when they studied the official COVID figures being released by Public Health England and identified that they were counting deaths in a way that artificially inflated them, which is because if you were registered as having tested positive for COVID-19 and then you got better, but then you died anyway of something else entirely, you would be recorded as a COVID-19 death. So if you instead use the system that, for instance, Scotland has been using throughout, where they don't do that, then you get a significantly reduced death count. So the UK death count has been reduced now by 5,000, down from 46,706 to 41,329. Not only that, but for most recent weeks of data, the drop is even more dramatic, a decline of 75% from 442 to 111. This graph shows what it does to the most recent deaths, from the red column before correction to the blue ones afterwards. So maybe it's not surprising that The Economist magazine this week showed that the British are more afraid to leave their homes than the French, the Germans, the Italians, or even the Spanish, whose country, after all, is seeing the most vigorous wave of infections at the moment. And with or without lockdown policies, that level of fear has an impact. So we had some of the second quarter economy figures this week. And the UK's economy has been one of the worst hit by the pandemic and by the shutdown policy that came with it. A 22% fall in the second quarter from the beginning of the year. Spain was nearly as badly hit. Then you had France, Italy, and then at 10% or less you had Germany, the US and Sweden. And this has prompted some to come in and once again declare Sweden, which followed its distinctive policy of minor life adjustments but no major lockdown, that Sweden was the clear winner. So, for instance, Alistair Heath wrote this for the Sunday Telegraph, which, to be fair, has always tended to the lockdown sceptical side. So now we know Sweden got it largely right and the British establishment catastrophically wrong. Anders Tegnell, Stockholm's epidemiologist king, has pulled off a remarkable triple whammy. Far fewer deaths per capita than Britain, a maintenance of basic freedoms and opportunities, including schooling, and most strikingly, a recession less than half as severe as our own. Well, that's a little overstated. Sweden saw 572 deaths per million, the UK has 609 deaths. It's not that far apart. But of course it is true to say that it could be identical, and you would still have an economy that suffered only half the setbacks to date than has the UK economy. But you should beware of people brandishing stats in order to support their favoured policy prescriptions, because at some point you look harder at those figures and you realise there's some interesting selection that they're making. Because really there's a pretty solid case that we should have aspired to be Germany rather than Sweden. Whereas the UK has 609 deaths per million and Sweden has 572 deaths per million, Germany has 111, less than a fifth of Sweden's tally. But Germany's economy has also contracted by less than half the amount that the UK's has, slightly more than Sweden, but not that much more. So if you weren't playing favourites with your preferred policy position and you were just going by the outcomes, it's hard to understand why you wouldn't be asking what Germany did right and whether those lessons might have been transferable to the UK. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes it's down to national culture or population density or dumb luck. But you should at least be asking yourself a question. Probably when this is all over, we'll be asking ourselves another question as well. Which of the countries managed to avoid screwing the future of the next generation with their policy responses? Because we're seeing plenty of evidence across the world that it's kids whose education is being disrupted who are possibly going to bear the scars of all of this for the longest period of time. In the UK, we've had headlines this week talking about exam result chaos. Huge government blunders, hard cases of kids in tears and facing a blighted future because of a wayward algorithm. It's a reminder that this stuff matters. Through the first wave of COVID-19, we had a cohort of youngsters who would have ordinarily been sitting their A-level exams, the results of which would normally dictate which universities they might be able to get into, which is, life-changing stuff. And this gave the government something of a problem because it was decided they couldn't sit those exams because of the virus. I personally think, 2020 hindsight, that was the mistake right there. It would have been logistically difficult to run the exams, but failing to do it was the first domino in an ugly chain of consequences. And once that fell, there were just no good options. How do you attribute results to kids if you don't hold the exams? Well, it was decided to get their teachers to estimate what their results would have been. And that is an awful system. Just a rotten, stupid idea. Why? Because all the incentives in that system go the wrong way. Selfish teachers want their schools to look good, so they have an incentive to artificially inflate the results. Good-hearted teachers want their pupils to do well, so mark them as generously as they can within the bounds of their own judgment and conscience, which also artificially inflates the results. As a result, the first cut of the results had double the number of top grades awarded compared to the previous years. At that point, you are solidly in the trap. Whatever you do here is going to be bad. You're in a hole. There's no ladder, just a spade. All you can do is keep digging. So the governments, and I say governments plural because Scotland and the rest of the UK did this differently, end up applying the algorithm to the results to push them back into a statistically more usual outcome. And that naturally therefore led to a lot of results being downgraded from what the teachers had put forward. And that led naturally to huge amounts of outrage and heartbreak and tough cases and miscarriages of justice. Because there's only so far that a rather hurried exercise in statistical modelling is going to cope with variation on this scale. Certain schools, for instance, where they have a specialism, where they consistently overperform on a certain subject, and kids who go to those schools get the benefit of that superior experience in that subject. But the algorithm knocks a bunch of them back into line. Boom! One school talked about how its high-performing cohort had been affected. A group who were excelling, none of them were expected based on previous performance and mock exam performance, expected to get less than a B. But that's not statistically likely. So boom! The lowest B was knocked down. Not to a C, not to a D, but to an E. Put yourself in the shoes of that pupil when they receive that result. The Scottish Government launched their results and within the first day of outrage immediately backtracked and announced that instead they would go with what the teachers originally put in. Which was the least worst option, right? Because you might as well make more people happy even if some of them didn't deserve it, rather than making some people incredibly unhappy. Well, it's no more fair. It's just less visible. Pupils who would have earned the top marks through their hard work and application are suddenly in a larger group with people who didn't deserve that score, competing with them for the same fixed number of university places. That outcome has been deeply unfair to those children. But it's less criticism for the politicians, so too bad. In the rest of the UK, they aim to hold the line a bit more robustly by having an appeals process that is designed to tackle what was admitted to be inevitable errors and injustices at the individual level. Universities are supposed to hold some of their places for the results of those appeals. But how long do we think those appeals are going to take? Because overloaded bureaucracies have such a fabulous track record, after all, of turning things around really quickly, don't they? In the meantime, students who expected to get A's have results that gave them a C or a D. They have the stress of trying to get that reversed while not knowing if their favoured place will disappear before it's cleared up. And this is just one of the more visible signs of the damage. I was a school governor in my village for a couple of years. I noted how incredibly tough the school aimed to be on parents who took their kids out of school for a holiday during term time. The head teacher pointed to all of the research showing how every week out of school set the pupil back and disadvantaged them, long term. We've had kids out of schools for months now, and surveys have suggested that a certain percentage of them have done no school work at all during that period. People talk about the disparity in educational outcomes between rich and poor families. Well, it's the poorer families where maybe the parents didn't do so well in schools themselves and don't really see the value of it, where those kids will have had zero pressure to keep up with it. So that relative disadvantage is now never going to be removed from those children. They have been out for months, not weeks. And that will be invisible harm as far as the system's concerned. This is why the debate around getting kids back to school has become so fraught in so many places across the world. With governments pushing hard for kids to be back by the autumn, even as some teachers and teachers' unions are resisting the push. Some parents desperate to get their kids back to school because they know their education is key to their future and because they've reached the end of their tether when it comes to homeschooling. And some parents are desperate not to have them go back because they've been so terrified that they will catch coronavirus and die. which is statistically one of the least likely things to happen. Really tiny, vanishingly small chance that could happen. But because of the blanket coverage of the pandemic, as we saw last week, people have become largely convinced that the actual risks are way higher than they are. And then you get other factors, like the US media's anti-Trump bias, which means that when Trump said that kids were immune to the virus, which was, I assume, his slightly clumsy way of saying pretty much what I just said. So not immune, but highly unlikely to get more than trivial illness from it. And the younger ones, highly unlikely to pass it on to adults. But because Trump said it, they simply had to pile on and show how wrong he was, rather than taking the opportunity to explain to parents why, even if the words weren't exactly right, the message was broadly right and they could send their kids back to school, they had to attack Trump. And in so doing, reinforce the fear for some of sending their kids back to school. But he was right. Out of the more than 163,000 people that have died in the US from COVID-19, 86 of them were children. Now look, that's 86 personal tragedies. None of those individual stories should be dismissed, of course. But statistically, if you were determined to avoid even those tiny odds, you'd never let your kids out the door. Ever. Still, in the US, the plateauing figures on COVID cases at least takes some of the intensity out of the debate on that side. But that meant the American people have been more able to get on with their lives and, focus on the fact that there's an election coming up. And at last, some people are saying, it's good to finally know who the Democratic candidate against Donald Trump is going to be. Which is a bit on the savage side. But savage is what it's going to be for the next 81 days. Because this really is where the election proper begins to get underway. Donald Trump and Mike Pence versus Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. Biden had been pondering whether he should go for an ambitious, talented would-be president or whether to go with a safe, unambitious number two who wouldn't outshine him and wouldn't be scaring any horses. The fact that he went for the former could be read in a number of ways. One, it could be read that he himself doesn't believe that he will see out a full term and he needs someone who can take the reins when the time comes. Two, it could be that he does expect to see out that term, but he wants a VP who's going to do some of the heavy lifting during the period. And three, some have even suggested that he knows he can't make it even as far as the election. And a plan is bubbling up that he will actually step aside for her at the last minute. Which of those you believe comes down to how serious a problem in terms of cognitive decline you believe Biden to have? In a recent poll, a majority, 59% of the American public, said that they didn't think Biden would make it through a full term. So to all intents and purposes, this has to be a full presidential candidate caliber vice presidency. But what sort of president will she be? Will she be a radical? Is she a safe pair of hands? You can hear both versions, depending on where you get your analysis. There's no doubt that the radical wing of the Democrats don't see her as wholly opposed to them, but they definitely don't see her as one of their own. There are reports of some dismay in the progressive camp because they think that by choosing Harris, and assuming that makes her the front runner next time, that effectively shuts the progressives out. Norman Solomon, the co-founder of the left-wing group rootsaction.org, said this: "We might be looking at 12 years of neoliberal power at the top of the Democratic Party because of the spectre of a very young and ambitious, as most politicians are, person on the ticket. That's a real fear." You may feel that America would never vote for one of the more extreme candidates anyway, and you may well be right. Obviously, that's not what they think. And since few people predicted Trump would make it before we prove them wrong, well, you shouldn't be too quick to think you definitely know how this plays out. Nevertheless, while the radicals don't think she's a radical, the Trump campaign is certainly going to be pointing to her support for some of the pretty radical positions over the last couple of years, not least Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's Green New Deal. One columnist I read in the London Times this week likened her in one sense to Bill Clinton, as someone who could move from one policy position to another depending on which seemed to have the momentum at the time. Which I suppose is why during the earlier primary campaign she could be there implying that Joe Biden might be, just a little bit racist. and the time she really went after him was the high point of her campaign. But that's all forgotten now. Whichever side you're on, you shouldn't get too self-righteous about that, because it's sort of built into the American system. I still find it a remarkable way of going about things, to be honest. You have a first round where a number of people who are supposed to be on the same side do their absolute best to destroy each other in public. And then when they've finished, they're meant to gather round and support one of the people they just trashed and destroyed, hoping they didn't do such a good job of trashing and destroying that they've now made that person unelectable. That's the system. And it kind of incentivizes these behaviours. Unfortunately, the current state of the Democrats apparently incentivizes other behaviours as well. So, for instance, Joe Biden announcing in advance that whoever he was going to pick was definitely going to be a woman. And then you had the letter from 100 activists, preachers, rappers and celebrities, which I refer to as the Henry Ford letter. You can have any skin colour you like, so long as it's black. Luckily, Kamala Harris qualifies, even though you might think she's a very pale black, being actually half African American and half Indian. I'm still very old-fashioned when it comes to these things. I think that, Martin Luther King Jr. had the right pitch. And if you want to test a statement, you should be able to invert it and still have it sound okay. So if we could have written a letter demanding that Joe Biden's next pick must be a white man, and that would be a non-cancelled thing if you did that, well, then I guess we have an enduring principle. But if instead, when you put it that way, it sounds like it would be a repulsive thing to write, then it's a repulsive thing to write, whichever way round you do it. As it is, you now have Kamala Harris, who perhaps had the qualities to make this on the basis of her own merit, but we'll never know, because she rose to the top of an artificially small pile. Don't trouble me with the content of your character. Show me the colour of your skin. Now look, people will take the opportunities put in front of them when they're ambitious. I can't imagine, though, that she wouldn't have preferred to have been selected without the prior promises to pander towards tokenistic thinking. But it is what it is. We'll know that America no longer has a problem with race when such selections happen amongst a genuinely diverse pool of people and nobody much mentions or focuses on it. And we're some way away from that by all evidence. So how will things go from here? Well, it's an open field. Trump is some way behind in the polls, but then he was in 2016. George H.W. Bush was further behind at this point in 1988, but came back from there to win. We're going to see debates where Biden's potential cognitive issues will be thrown into the spotlight, or if they're really panicked, they'll cancel the debates, which will send its own warning signals, probably just as strong. We'll see some vigorous attacks on Kamala Harris. We don't know how much the American people will treat her as a normal VP candidate or whether they'll see her instead as the real candidate. We may see coronavirus starting to recede. We don't know how much that will change how people see the contest. It is still very much wide open. We can say very little for certain except that this is going to be an election campaign unlike any other we've seen before. And that is the safest prediction for 2020 you are ever going to hear. In the meantime, life goes on. These last couple of weeks it's been very hot here in the UK, and you'd expect sales of ice cream to be through the roof. I dare say they are. But ice cream has also been at the centre of a mini row as the lovable old hippies at Ben & Jerry's decided to launch a Twitter offensive aimed at the Home Secretary Priti Patel, schooling her on the compassionate approach to illegal immigration. There's been a lot of discussion on the subject in recent weeks, with higher numbers of boats arriving from France with illegal immigrants stacked into them, and the government looking for more robust action to send them back. None of which has an obvious link to ice cream. But Ben & Jerry's UK tweeted this anyway. Hey Priti Patel, we think the real crisis is our lack of humanity for people fleeing war, climate change and torture. Arguing that it should be made easier, not harder, for refugees to come to Britain, it said, people wouldn't make dangerous journeys if they had any other choice. The Home Office was not entirely impressed with being lectured on the subject. One source there said, Priti is working day and night to bring an end to these small boat crossings, which are facilitated by international criminal gangs. If that means upsetting the social media team for a brand of overpriced junk food, then so be it. Ouch! Feel that burn. Now, this is interesting for really only one reason, and it has nothing to do with whether you're in support or opposition to the message itself. Because obviously you should see straight off the bat that this is pure marketing. Ben & Jerry's has, for all of its history really, actively promoted itself to the eco-activist left. And that's a large enough niche to happily support a brand of premium ice cream, and good luck to them. They'll need it. After all, it's a niche that can turn on you the moment you make a mistake. Just ask the Green Party, who had the Extinction Rebellion splinter group Beyond Politics vandalising their headquarters this week with their trademark pink paint. And the Green Party's only mistake was that they hadn't abolished international capitalism yet. Puh! Such a bunch of slackers they are. The reason why the Ben & Jerry tweets made headlines was that they were more specific and more political on an issue that's seen as highly contentious. That's what got it the attention. Plus the direct named challenge to the existing Home Secretary of the day. And that's what makes it good marketing. It got lots of profile. And if you think, ooh, they really made a mistake because of all the negative response they got, you're missing the point. The negativity came exclusively from the other side, as it was always bound to. People who are not their target audience, probably have never consumed their product ever, and certainly wouldn't as a matter of course. And the fact that those people are attacking them just strengthens the support that they will get from their actual target audience. But of course there is an element of discomfort here, and it comes from for the corporate owner of the brand, which is Unilever. Unilever is a very sustainability-minded company. I interviewed the recent chief executive of Unilever, Paul Polman, for the podcast. There's an excerpt of that interview on this channel. But they're mainstream, not niche. They have many, many brands. They make many products across the world. They have to be mainstream in a way, for sure, that's beneficial to the communities in which they're based and similarly positive to the environment, but mainstream. And this is the difference that a lot of people in recent years haven't really understood between mainstream companies who understand that pragmatic approach to enlightened self-interest means that they pay attention, genuine attention, to making sure that their business serves society and doesn't despoil it. The difference between those companies and the rising woke corporations. And the woke corporations go further to support specifically left-wing causes in a much more explicitly partisan way in order to sell to that community and to attract those employees. Here you have an example of the latter owned by the former, woke Ben & Jerry's, mainstream Unilever. But much of the negative kickback didn't simply rail against the lovable old hippie brigade, but went straight for Unilever. Ben & Jerry's is virtue signalling on this, but meanwhile their parent corporation is doing X, whatever X may be. And with any large global corporation, there's always going to be X. And you might well expect that the people in Unilever headquarters not entirely comfortable with exactly how this particular brand initiative is working out. And they should be uncomfortable. The biggest threat to companies finding sensible ways to create wealth in a world that cares about sustainability is if executives lose the plot and mistakenly think they all have to sign up to the truly woke agenda. That will kill the whole thing dead in its tracks quicker than anything else. In the meantime, we do the best we can in interacting with the big companies that we have to deal with. Which is my cue to inform you that last week's video got, yes, demonetized by YouTube. Permanently this time. It wasn't overturned on appeal. I look at the content of that video, I have no idea why that one got demonetized permanently. Seems to be an entirely random thing if you deal with controversial current issues. One week they'll go one way, another week they'll go the other. Which is why it's been so important for this channel to have people supporting it via Patreon. Without that support, it would be really difficult to be able to put in the time needed to make these videos in the way that I do, and to continue to focus on the issues that matter without having to play safe with the YouTube algorithm, even though there's every indication that it would be pushing harder to promote this channel if I did it exactly that. So, if you want to join the wonderful people who have already done so in supporting the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content that I aim to produce on this channel, please go to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. Either way, have a great week. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show.